All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of In the Arena Live. For those of you joining us live, feel free to put your comments in there. Tell us what you think. Give us feedback. We're excited to have you as part of this community. So feel free to be active as we talk during this half hour. We want you to be a part of the conversation. So today we're going to be talking about, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Michelle. We're going to be talking about the recent episode on Monday with Michelle Kim, who is an author of the recent book called The Wake Up. She's also a CEO and really a social justice warrior. So our conversation was all around the ways in which we can wake up to how we show up in society, how we change the kind of conversation around redemption, and how we all become more accountable and empathetic when it comes to our ability to change the way that social justice in the world works today. So I'm joined by MK, who I'm going to have introduced herself, and then we're going to jump right in. We can't wait to hear what you all have to think or have to say. And if you're joining us later, that's okay too. If you leave comments, we can always see them and respond. So we're excited to have you as part of the conversation as well. And MK, I'll pass it off to you.
It's so nice to meet you all. Thanks for joining us either live now in the arena or a little bit later as well. If you're watching this recording, I am MK. I am a positive psychology practitioner, a recent graduate of the Master's in Applied Positive Psychology program at Penn. And I'm also Leah's teammate at LinkedIn on the talent development team. So super excited to jump into this conversation today with everyone.
Yes, and I love, MK, that you have studied positive psychology as I have, and we will be done with the same program as of next year. I'm now in my third year of having to defer because I just can't do it online, but you were brave enough to go do that, and I've gotten to get so much goodness from you, just kind of stepping ahead of me in that process. So I love having another positive psychology enthusiast / for you practitioner.
As do I. I love it. I love our positive psychology detours and little conversations here and there. I feel like we learn a lot from each other, so it's awesome.
I know. And, it's even in this conversation, thinking about, the intensity and the importance of conversations like these. If you're not familiar with positive psychology, it's the science of human flourishing. So it's the understanding of the things that we can do to actually engineer what can go right in our lives versus the study of just what goes wrong in the human experience. And so there's also, MK, kind of this like levity that comes with being able to talk about, moving towards this instead of what's wrong with all of us, what are we all messing up? What are we all able to actually create and what potential do we have?
Totally. Yeah. And I think, and we'll dive into this a little bit later too, but I think as humans, we're wired towards focusing on what's wrong. And we have this innate negativity bias because it's a bit of a survival instinct for us. And so to even think about a lot of what Michelle Kim spoke about, we need to get a little bit more comfortable with normalizing redemption and recognizing that we can learn from our mistakes and focusing on things that are going right and focusing on one or two things that we can do to continue to improve our lives as professionals and frankly, as humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you haven't familiarized yourself with Michelle Kim and you're watching this, I would highly recommend you go follow her on LinkedIn, pick up her book or purchase it, through Kindle on Amazon. Her book is called The Wake Up, and Michelle really is, like I said, a social justice warrior, and her focus is really about how all of our liberation is bound together. So her book is not just the kind of typical, what I feel is typical DEI conversations. It's really, when I read it and saw her work, it's really about diversity kind of 2.0, as I'm calling it, or, showing up even more and really understanding what's under the hood. And the other piece that I thought was interesting, or part of the reason I initially reached out to Michelle, was her article last year that came out on Medium was about the fact that, the Asian community needed to kind of band together with the Black community to support liberation. And growing up in Oakland, which is a very diverse city, and in the Bay Area, which is a very diverse place, it was something that I hadn't heard before. And so that's actually what brought me to Michelle. Then, of course, this conversation unfolded even more because of her book. But, MK, you and I were talking, as we started to kind of prepare for this conversation about what stood out. And one of the things we talked about was this innate desire to belong, which I think keeps people from showing up for other people, even when a situation calls for it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree, Leah. I feel like some of the things that Michelle mentioned in the podcast, this idea of good being transient, and I know you and her kind of unraveled this piece of goodness and everyone wanting to be good and attaching it to your identity, but it's hard. When you're going through this day and you have a lot of different decisions to make, a lot of different actions and behaviors, and especially in the work around social justice that Michelle has done for so many years, attaching goodness to your identity and wanting to always strive for that, I feel sometimes means that you don't really know when you're able to let go of that and realize that it shouldn't be attached to who you are. You can strive to be it, but it's not always going to be that way. Goodness is transient. It's something you work towards.
Totally. This showed up as, allyship as a verb was a really common conversation last year around the time of George Floyd's murder. And also just in general, you and I studying positive psychology, thinking about how, we can create better or more meaningful lives for ourselves. People might associate that with how do we become good people? Or, even the other day I was talking to a neighbor and they said something like, this is a good neighborhood. And so, it's which is hysterical to me. I'm like, I live in New York. I don't know what a good neighborhood is. Everything's accessible by train. So I don't think anything.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting to think about, we tie ourselves to this idea of good and people saying they're good people or they have a good life or it's a good neighborhood. And it doesn't really allow for any space for mistake making, for, messing it up or for, us to just be human, which that's all part of the process.
Yeah, totally. And I think to your point, it's so funny when you say something like good neighborhood, because when you think about a neighborhood, you ultimately, if you're moving into a new place, which I know, Leah, you're back in the old neighborhood, but you're in a new place technically. We were chatting about this too, the sense of belonging, right? Like a neighborhood is a community where ultimately I think everyone has that innate desire to be accepted and to belong. And when we think about good being transient, I'd love to hear your thoughts and also the audience's thoughts on belonging being transient, because you might feel like one day you belong in a community if you went to, a social distance potluck and you can chat with folks and you feel comfortable. And then the next day, maybe something happens and you feel like, oh, maybe I don't belong. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of this tension, this innate desire to want to be accepted and to belong and to feel that sense of community. But also every day there might be actions or inactions that change how you feel like you belong with the community.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point and something I hadn't thought about before, belonging being transient. I think so. It reminds me of this book by Brene Brown called Braving the Wilderness, which a lot of the book is around belonging to yourself. And so there is this transience to belonging if you attach belonging to other people, because people change and you change. And so like, I think of that. And I also, when I think about belonging, I think about like what I believe is its antithesis, which is loneliness, right? Like the worst thing for so many of us. And one of the most common things that's happened for people in the last, 20 plus months of being at home is feeling lonely. And yesterday I was doing a meditation through the Daily Calm app, and it was about aloneness. And the idea was that there is a difference between loneliness and aloneness. And so in a way, it's like if you believe belonging is about everybody else, that really actually has more to do with, as Brene Brown would define it, fitting in, right? Than actually belonging. Mm-hmm. You can bring the definition maybe of belonging back to self, and, actually align that to, I want to belong. And maybe right now I feel alone, but I'm not lonely. There's there's a healthier way to view it. And I say this from a perspective of, I live in New York. It can feel like one of the loneliest places in the world, even though millions of people live here. So, I think belonging is transient if you tie it to everyone else and how you're going to fit in with them. But I'm curious, like, I always love opposing viewpoints. Do you have like a different way of looking at it, or how do you think about belonging?
I don't know. I love that idea that you just mentioned just now, Leah, about this idea of aloneness versus loneliness, because loneliness on its own as a word, I feel like there's a negative connotation. Nobody ever feels like they want. Like nobody desires to be lonely. They might say that on the outside, like, oh, I'm happy being by myself. But that's a different feeling than, oh, I'm lonely and I like it. Being alone, I think, has a more neutral connotation. So that's super interesting, that you found that from a meditation. And now I kind of want to dig into like etymology of those words, or kind of, do our usual
research on aloneness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like add to the list of things.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. Yeah, no, I don't know if I have an opposing viewpoint. I think it's something that, especially with a word like belonging, at LinkedIn, rather than calling it DEI, we call it diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And so I do feel like it's an important component of a lot of this work around continued sustained change. But I also wonder, when we think about belonging to the self versus fitting in with others, there's an element of self-compassion in there potentially. And I'm wondering, Leah, what you think about that. Is that, belonging to yourself, it's a little bit of self-acceptance and self-compassion too.
Yeah. And it's like you know me well enough to know how much I love the Enneagram, and I'm an Enneagram 7. And so, gosh, it's like, in some ways, the 7s have a lot of challenge with belonging, with being alone, I should say, or being bored. Mm-hmm. So I definitely have struggled with, that was what led me down a lot of this path in the first place, was, do I like being with myself? And there's like that quote that if you like being with yourself, you can never be lonely, right? And so you don't look for belonging or fitting in a group of people, because you've already got it within yourself. And funny enough, when you do create it within yourself is when I believe you actually attract that to you, and you have more people who do want to be a part of your circle. So the way that we talk about, I think, belonging is, or we might think about belonging, or be trained to think about belonging, is really about fitting in, which is about filling a hole that you feel, which could be the loneliness hole, versus what you're saying, which is self-compassion and, acceptance of self. And so you on your own can fill that, and then, go out into the world and create a real sense of belonging, which is, I can truly be me with others around me, and there are people that kind of are in my flock. Yeah. And so I mean, it's interesting, because you said this work is called Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging at LinkedIn. It's called DEI or D&I. And one thing that came up with Michelle was really that this is human work, that it's not just about DEI. It's not only about politics, though obviously politics has a huge impact on each of us as humans, right? And then us as professionals. So it has to do with it. But that typically we bucket this into spheres that allow us to decide whether or not we feel like tapping in or not. And so it can kind of feel like, well, this cause is a great cause, but today I don't feel charitable. And it was interesting, because in our conversation and in her book, Michelle talks about your why. And she talks about this difference between this unsustainable why and the sustainable or enduring why. She shares that the unsustainable why, which is something that I think so many of us have been trained to think in this way, is really around, like, I want to do the right thing, right? Or I want someone to have the experiences or privilege that I had, or I want to give to a good cause. And she actually says that it's an unsustainable why. And one thing I love about Michelle is she just tells it like it is. Like, she's not sugarcoating for anybody. She's very much about the fact that, like, this is not comfortable. And so she's not going to, create comfort, but she is going to support you in creating change. But that when you're thinking about that enduring why, she uses the Audre Lorde quote that our liberation is bound together. So in the same way, I feel like, when we cordon this off and say, this is only Dibs work, or this is only DEI work, or this is only a political conversation, we sort of excuse ourselves from the equation. And then we really don't have this enduring why of, could it be possible that if we want to all have freedom and all be able to feel like we can be ourselves and show up, we have to also support the people who have been, victimized by the systems that we live in.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree, Leah. And I found that part of the podcast really powerful, because Michelle talks about it as human work. It's fully human work, and it's everyone's work, right? When we think about human work, ultimately, the bottom line is we're all bound together by our common humanity. like that's kind of the lowest common denominator, I think, of who we are. And so when we think about this work, it can be daunting to think about, every day you need to commit to something and you feel like you need something big. But actually, I think, and this gets into later part of the episode too, is Michelle mentioned something about just focusing on one or two meaningful things for you that tie back to your enduring why. And if you have that enduring why there, it won't feel like as much effort. It's part of who you are. It's now tied to your values. And it doesn't need to be a big thing every day. It could just be specifically around small spheres of influence that are most meaningful to you. So I love that piece around the unsustainable versus enduring why. And I think also just being fully transparent and realistic, figuring out your enduring why is a whole journey and process on its own.
I was going to ask you about
that. Years, right? It could take years. It could change over time. You might feel like you have an enduring why, from your 20s, and then by your late 30s or 40s or 50s, your enduring why changes, and maybe not frequently, and maybe it all roots down to kind of the same common value that you hold. But I do feel like it will morph slightly over time. I wonder if that's, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Leah, on that?
Oh, I completely agree. I think there's the enduring why. It's kind of like in the same way a lot of people talk about finding your purpose, and it's as if there's only one purpose. Or there goes my dog. She's a constant here, but it's as if there's only kind of one reason for showing up and for being. And the truth is, that changes over time. And if we don't allow it to change, we can actually burn out. So we don't endure because we don't allow transformation to take place. So that would be my thought, and I'd love for you to chime in while Piper quiets down.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like I love that you use transformation there, because sometimes you can hold on to something and feel like this is how you've defined yourself. And this kind of, again, goes back to that idea of goodness and people wanting to always be good, because it feels like in that way you can be accepted and get a sense of belonging. But at the same time, you have to develop that sense of self-awareness in terms of what is your enduring why today. And maybe for the next 10 years, it's very similar, but maybe sometime after that, something happens in your life to you, or you change, and you now have this transformation that takes you to this, not that you're leveling up in life per se, but you're in a new, you've transformed, you've grown. And I think Michelle touches a lot on that too. And that kind of comes to some of the tail end of the episode around normalizing redemption and accountability. And there's this one quote that I loved from the episode, Leah, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it now. The idea it's the grappling, the reflecting, the taking accountability, the struggle to become the person we want to be. It's so sacred. And I love that, because in that quote encapsulates the idea that as humans, we can strive to be good, we can strive to belong, we can strive to find our enduring why, but it's the tiny iterations that we make every day as a human, the grappling, the realizing we've made a mistake and that we need to hold ourselves accountable, or getting the courage to hold other people accountable. I think that's really, really important. And so, I think that's something that I wanted to share with everyone, that quote.
I love that quote. And it reminds me of this morning, I was reading a book that's about how to start big, meaningful work in your life. And the author uses a metaphor of this baseball that I think he said hangs in Indiana. And the baseball has 25,000 layers of paint on it. They've started with just one layer. And so his whole point about, I know, I was like, wow, I've never even heard of this. And apparently I need to spend more time in the middle of the country because I've never been there, but can't wait. And so, it hangs in this barn that's been constructed for it. People come from far and wide to see it. And his whole point was that if we could imagine growth as something that's layer by layer, then number one, we can be okay with life being about small steps, right? And number two, maybe we can be okay with those moments where we do mess up. And so I feel like there's sometimes this idea that growth, at least in my mind, historically, it was like growth is all positive. And I'm sure you've learned, and I've definitely learned through experience and through study that it's absolutely not true. A lot of growth comes through the really negative experiences. In fact, I'd say a lot of people learn and grow through pain and not through some joyful kind of like celebratory thing where all of a sudden, life is perfect. But I want to just take a minute on redemption because I think it's incredibly important. And I love that you shared that quote. I've been curious about redemption for quite a while, especially as someone who's been, watching the news, and as a Black woman who's been watching the news and seeing over the last couple of years the highlights around people who've done things that we as a society consider to be wrong. And they absolutely are wrong. And at the same time, I started to get curious, like, if someone does hold themselves, if we can hold someone accountable and they can also hold themselves accountable for the mistake they've made, do we really need to be kicking everybody off the boat? Or can we say, okay, this person's been held accountable. They've also held themselves accountable. They've righted the wrong as much as they could. And we're going to let it go. And so it sparked in me this quote that I've heard that in order for forgiveness to take place, something has to die, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of times it's easy to hold on to our anger about one person or something, but for better or worse, I generally tend to kind of look at all sides and try to give my own empathy to situations, and I can see how things take place in the way they do. And I would love to see more of that redemption when someone holds themselves accountable. I want to be very clear about that. Not just redemption for redemption's sake, but redemption has to marry with accountability.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm seeing comments in the feed here too, where everyone's enjoying this conversation about redemption. And I love what you mentioned, Leah, because you're right. It's like the first step needs to be accountability. And I do think also accountability, other people can hold someone where there's a wrong behavior accountable to a certain extent, but ultimately that person themselves also has to realize when what they've done is incorrect or has, been not inclusive or was a racist behavior. And so I think first piece is accountability. And then that second piece around redemption, normalizing it, I think is a good thing, and I don't think celebrate is the word either, but just acknowledging it and kind of giving people the sense that it's okay to do that and letting them have that space, right? Because I think when someone is trying, it's very vulnerable when you realize, one, for you to accept, and I think this has happened to everyone, including myself, when you realize you've done something wrong, you've done something that is a behavior that doesn't align with your values, or something that was a racist behavior or was a non-inclusive behavior, your first reaction is often very defensive. And then when you can get to the point where you can hold yourself accountable and open up and say, you know what, I'm sorry, I was wrong. This was an incorrect behavior. And going forward, I'd like to do this differently. And here's how I'm going to try and be better. I think that takes courage. And I think, to your point, holding people who are in the news and being angry at them for years doesn't do anyone any good.
Yeah. And it's a lot of times this conversation moves to racism, which is obviously a huge part of what this country and this world experiences that's got to go, and it doesn't work for any of us. And also I'll put a quick pin in the fact that in this conversation, Michelle talks about how just because you're in a privileged group, whether it have to do with racism, ableism, elitism, sexism, actually doesn't mean that you are not impacted. You're still impacted by the fact that systems exist that oppress certain people, and even when they're putting you ahead, because they box you in and they keep you from being able to be the person that you want to actually be, right? Because we're talking about belonging, right? If you're in a group of people that decides that they're an elitist group of people, right? You then have to fit into that group in order to be okay, right? In order to belong or fit in with that. And I don't use those interchangeably. You have to fit in with that group in order to be okay, right? Yeah. So it actually does still hurt you, even when you're in the privileged group, to have the experience of, others not being able to be a part of it. Which, by the way, all of these conversations, like, this stuff is hard. This is not easy stuff that we're talking about. We all mess it up. So I want to also just call that out. We can have a conversation, and, I'm so glad people are liking this conversation, and, we're going to give you a couple of things we'd love for you to try out that are really simple steps that I think encapsulate this a little bit, even more at an even higher level than just the conversation of social justice. But, these conversations are about talking about some of these things and recognizing that we're all going to screw it up. Like that's really where we're coming from, is we've all got stories of where we've done this right and where we've done it wrong. And something I loved about what Michelle shared too was that she's done it wrong, right? And she's someone that, you know, many people hold on a pedestal as someone who's doing, and she is doing amazing work, but that doesn't mean she's devoid of mistakes. So I just want to call that out as, you know, as part of these conversations, is really about just being kind of honest, talking about the topic, but also recognizing like we don't get it right all the time.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think, and then that ties right back to our first point, which is like it's human work, and we're all humans, and as humans, we have to give ourselves space and a little bit of self-compassion and develop that self-awareness to make these mistakes, and then of course hold ourselves accountable and continue to be better.
Okay, MK, what would the positive psychologist say about all this?
I'll try my best here, Leah. I think a lot of this does come down to, you know, what we talked about originally around belonging. And in one of the well-being frameworks by Dr. Marty Seligman, he talks about PERMA, and it's there's 5 different pillars, but R in PERMA stands for relationships. And so one of the most famous positive psychologists, Chris Peterson, has always said that positive psychology boils down to one thing or one statement: other people matter. And I think to kind of sum up this conversation, that we've covered so many different aspects here of what it means to belong and what it means to find your enduring why, whether it's in your day-to-day work, whether it's in your social justice work, or whatever it might be as an ongoing ally and practicing ally. I think other people matter is a pretty good way to sum it up.
Wow, I wrote that down. Other people matter. It's true. So speaking of other people matter, we have 2 ideas for you. If you're listening now, listening later, either way, 2 things that you can do that we think will move you a step forward. So, you know, part of this process is, of course, deepening your learning, but also forwarding your action, and not saying we're going to go change the world. It's just, what small thing can I do in my sphere, right? So the first one is around, you know, when we thought about this work, one of the words that came up was just empathy, right? Empathy everywhere. Empathy in general allows us to not say, I excuse this person, or I feel sorry for this person. It helps us actually stand with that person, say, I see how this could be happening for you or in your life, or how you could act in this way. Empathy opens up our hearts. Like that's pretty much what it does. And so if you're listening and empathy sounds resonant, we're curious if there's someone in your sphere today who would benefit from your empathy. And it can be about anything. The topic doesn't really matter. It's just about starting to practice some of these skills. Empathy can be learned, right? So you can actually work through this process. And the second is around accountability, because we also talked about the importance of, you know, normalizing redemption, but also understanding we all have to take accountability for the things that we do and the behaviors. It's not about you as a person, it's about what you've done. And so the second piece is, if accountability sounds like something that would be meaningful for you, is there somewhere in your life today that you can take just 10% more accountability for your actions, right? Where would that be? And also, why would it be impactful? So, you know, again, we talked about the why. The reason that you do this work is so personal. Whatever it is good, right? As long as it's meaningful to you, it's meaningful to us. It's meaningful for the world, right? Because it's going to propel you forward. So if there's a why behind that empathy or behind that accountability, that will help you actually move forward. So with that, we are at 30 after. We're going to sign off. It's been great seeing all of you in the chat. If you're tuning in later, thanks so much for tuning in. And Michelle, it's so funny. I want to call you Michelle and MK. MK, yep. It's so good to have you. And I can't wait to see you again. I know you'll be back in the next couple of weeks. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Leah. And thanks everyone for tuning in now, or if you're tuning in later. Hope you enjoyed the conversation, and do listen to this podcast episode and subscribe to In the Arena.
Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.